So back in 1998, I was 14 and living in Leeds. I liked football, my mom's shepherd's pie, and chucking sticks for our dog down at the park. Like most kids, I couldn't stand school. I hated it. But I had my best mate Danny to get me through the day. Me and Danny always caught the bus together after school. And no matter how rotten my day had been, he'd somehow make me laugh. That all changed the day Danny needed someone to cheer him up. Danny was a good kid. Never late, always did his homework, generally stayed out of trouble. Then one day, walking out of the boys' restroom, Danny accidentally bumped into a teacher, Mr. Carter, and ended up splashing hot tea all over the front of Carter's white shirt. Danny said sorry, but Carter flew off the handle. He acted like it had been deliberate, sent Danny to referral, worse than detention, and told the principal Danny had spilled a scalding drink on purpose. That turned it into a health and safety issue, and the principal wanted Danny expelled. Danny's parents begged them not to, and eventually the punishment was reduced to 2 weeks of after-school detention, plus 2 hours on Saturday mornings. They believed Danny hadn't meant it and told him to keep his mouth shut. Take the punishment and move on. Danny's older brother Paul wasn't so calm about it. Paul was nearly 3 years older and had his own grudge against Carter from when he was at the school. Seeing his little brother treated so unfairly sent Paul round the bend. He swore we'd get Carter back, but told us revenge should be a dish best served cold. At the time, I didn't really get it. Paul explained, if we rode past Carter's house and pelted it with rotten eggs that night, Carter would know who did it immediately. Wait a couple months and make it look like you'd forgotten about it, and he'd never guess. Do it on a night when everyone else was up to mischief and it would get lost in the chaos. Paul picked Mischief Night. For the record, mischief night's an old tradition, the night before a festival when kids play pranks. In a lot of places now it's on October 30, the night before Halloween, and the pranks range from eggs and toilet paper to more invasive stuff. Paul wanted to wait though because he wanted Carter to really suffer, not physically hurt. Paul wasn't that kind of kid, but to feel the sting of proper payback. A few weeks later he came up with a plan. Mr. Carter loved classic cars. He'd sunk a lot of money into a first series Jaguar E-Type, kept locked in his garage. The Jag was his pride and joy. Paul wanted to wreck it. Early October, we started planning, but we knew breaking in the middle of the night wouldn't work. Someone would wake up and call the police. We tossed around quieter ideas, slash the seats, spray paint rude words. Those weren't enough for Paul. He wanted Carter to suffer in a way that hurt. Paul recruited a mate, Marvin, to run a long con. For almost 3 weeks, Marvin would ride over at night, knock loudly on Carter's door, then pedal off. He'd report back that Carter was getting angrier each time. Chasing after him, shouting he'd give him a proper hiding. By Mischief Night, Carter was livid. Everything seemed to be falling into place. On the afternoon of the 30th, the whole school was buzzing. Me and Danny pretended like we weren't up to anything. I saw Carter in the corridor that day and felt my face go pale. I was terrified he might clock me looking shifty. At 3:15, I was relieved to go home. That evening, Paul had everything mapped out. Show up at their place at 7 p.m. Follow his lead and don't chicken out. Danny thanked me for helping and called me his best friend. That line crushed any last bit of doubt I had. A couple of hours later, the 4 of us were around the corner from Carter's house. Riding with the older lads, my nerves vanished. We hid our bikes down the street and Marvin snuck up Carter's path. He banged on the door, jumped back on his bike, and waited until Carter opened the door, then shouted, "Catch me if you can," and pedaled away. Carter went ballistic, swearing and storming after him, jumped in his car, not the Jag but his daily driver, and tore down the road in hot pursuit. Marvin later told us. Carter had driven up and down the neighborhood for a while hunting him, giving us a 10-15-minute window. We ran up Carter's driveway wearing gloves. Paul pulled a towel from his bag and Danny smashed the small garage window, the towel muffling the noise. Paul finished the rest of the window quietly and we slipped inside. Paul and Danny knocked out the remaining glass and then there was no Jaguar. The entire garage was empty where the car should have been. Months of planning and we'd come up with nothing. We could smash a few windows or stomp the flower beds, but that wouldn't be the hit Paul wanted. I suggested we leave and maybe bust a front window on the way out. Danny agreed, but Paul wasn't having it. He said there had to be something inside the garage that would wound Carter properly, and he wasn't leaving until he found it. There was an old foot locker with a padlock in the corner, the military-type chest, and Paul figured it probably held Carter's Army and Navy keepsakes. If we pinched those, he'd be devastated. There were rusty bolt cutters on a tool rack. Paul and Danny used them, the clack of the cutters loud as they cut the lock. They opened the trunk and started rifling through things. At first all I saw were envelopes, a lot of white envelopes that looked stuffed. I assumed money, but they were full of handwritten letters. There were a few pieces of jewelry, and Danny stuffed those into his pockets. Then Paul pulled out a framed photo of a young woman and a small glass jar with a lock of brown hair. For a second I thought she might be Carter's niece. But when Paul looked at the photo, he dropped it back like it burned him. Danny asked what was wrong. Paul told us to put the jewelry back and to get out. He sounded serious, dead serious. We slipped back out the broken window, grabbed the towel, and pedaled like mad until we were well away. Paul's last words were, "Follow me. Don't stop until I do." We were breathless and sore and asking why Paul suddenly reacted like that to a picture. It wasn't the girl that scared him. It was what had happened to her. Paul remembered things from before our time. A young woman had gone missing on Ilkley Moor not long before. Her face had been all over local papers, and there had been a huge search. No body was ever found, and she was assumed dead. The photo in Carter's trunk looked almost exactly like that missing girl. Danny argued, asking if Paul was sure. Paul was adamant, 110% sure. The letters, the jewelry, the lock of hair, they all pointed to the same thing. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't want to believe him. Maybe it was a keepsake from some long-ago romance, some relative. But Paul wasn't joking. He wouldn't have dragged us into Carter's garbage if he wasn't certain. At a phone box outside a row of shops, Paul went in, made an anonymous call to the police, and reported what he'd seen in Carter's trunk. He didn't explain how he knew, just that he'd seen the jewelry and the lock of hair and gave Carter's address. Then we rode off. That anonymous call made it real. We expected sirens and a flurry of police, maybe a helicopter. Instead, just one constable knocked on Carter's door, had a quick look around and left. We realized then that calling on mischief, night had probably made the whole thing look like pranks, like kids mucking around. Worse, by breaking into Carter's garage and opening his trunk, we'd given him a warning. If anything incriminating was in there, he could scrub the place clean before anyone took him seriously. In the weeks after, I kept waiting for Carter to be arrested. I avoided looking at him at school, terrified one look would give us away. Paul kept saying, "Be patient. Investigations take time," but nothing happened. Carter got away with it. After Christmas, there was an assembly announcement. Carter was leaving to teach abroad. At a school in Hong Kong, the principal called it a big opportunity. Only me, Danny, Paul, and Marvin knew the real reason he was leaving. We talked about it. Danny brought up extradition without knowing the word, wondering if Hong Kong would hand him over. Paul had a darker theory. Hong Kong had recently changed hands and might not have the same treaties, so Carter could move and avoid prosecution. Whatever the legalities, that's where Carter went. And it all felt like our fault. By cutting the padlock, we'd given him a heads up. We'd snuffed out any chance of the police stumbling on the same evidence later, during some vandalism follow-up. We'd aimed for revenge and instead paved his escape. The guilt never left me. Paul suffered the worst. He drank himself into ruin and, by 30, was an unemployed alcoholic. People called him a loser, but behind the label was a shame that ate him. Danny and I weren't immune either. That same shame and guilt sat inside both of us and never really went away. Even now, years later, I still feel that twinge, the memory of that night and the knowledge that, by trying to get justice, we may have driven it further from reach. I grew up in a small town called Shallow Water, about 10 miles outside of Lubbock, Texas. When I was 19, I worked at the X-Fab plant and usually hitched a ride with a couple of co-workers. Every morning, we'd stop at this tiny coffee shop called Hebrews for our daily caffeine fix. That's where I met a girl named Rita. We started chatting about donuts, arguing over which ones were the best, and after finding out she was single, we swapped numbers and started texting. We went on a few dates through October, and toward the end of the month, I asked if she had plans for Halloween. She said she was going to a party near the country club and told me I could tag along with her and her friends. Now, I was crazy about her back then, and none of my buddies had plans besides sitting at home playing PUBG. So, why not? I threw together a simple ghost face costume, same one I'd worn a few years before, and figured it'd be a good chance to show Rita's friends that I wasn't a total loser. The night actually went great, until Rita ran off to the bathroom and came back looking panicked. She said her ex had just shown up out of nowhere. The guy was supposed to be working on an oil rig down in the Gulf, but apparently plans changed. She told me I needed to leave, fast. Apparently her ex was the jealous, violent type, and if he figured out who she was with, there'd be a fight for sure. I didn't want to leave, but I also wasn't about to brawl with some angry oil field guy. So I said goodbye to Rita and her friends and slipped out the back. As I walked down the long driveway of that big old house, I heard yelling behind me, "Yeah, that's right! You better get out of here before I kick your ass." I turned to see some red-faced jerk being held back by his drunk buddies, still shouting as I hit the road. I decided to walk back home to Shallow Water. It would take a few hours, but I didn't care. My mind was spinning with thoughts of Rita, and I barely noticed the miles going by, until my phone buzzed. It was Rita, warning me that her ex and his buddies had been kicked out of the party. They were furious and planned to find me. That sinking feeling hit me hard. They had a car, and I was on foot. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. I'd lost my mask at the party, but I was still wearing the long black ghost face robe. So there I was, jogging down a Texas highway in the middle of the night, constantly looking over my shoulder, whispering, "Please don't be them," every time headlights appeared. Cars passed one by one until one slowed down beside me. My heart dropped. I thought, this is it. I turned my head, ready to see a car full of angry guys, but instead it was just one woman. She rolled down the passenger window and asked if I needed a ride. She looked like a regular suburban mom, SUV, purple sweater, warm smile. She said she figured I needed a lift if I was running along the highway dressed like that. I thanked her like she was a miracle sent from heaven. After making sure she was headed my way, I hopped in. She introduced herself as Deborah. When she asked why I was out there, I told her everything, about Rita, her ex, the party, the warning text, all of it. Deborah laughed, saying that's what I got for diving into the dating pool. I couldn't argue with that. She joked that I needed to find a nice girl to settle down with. I laughed and said I agreed about the nice girl part, but not the settling down part. Not at 19. She laughed again, like she expected that answer. We talked the whole drive, and when I mentioned I was heading back to Shallow Water, she said she was going the same direction. But then she turned off the main highway and started heading east down a dirt road. I thought maybe she'd taken a wrong turn, so I reminded her where I lived. She said she hadn't forgotten. She just needed to make a quick stop at a friend's house first. She was giving me a ride for free, so I didn't complain. We kept chatting as we drove deeper into the dark countryside. Then, out of nowhere, she stopped the car. The air went cold. I asked if everything was okay, but she didn't say a word. She reached into the door compartment and pointed a gun at me. For a few seconds, I just froze, not believing what was happening. Then she tossed a small black cloth bag at me and told me to put it over my head. I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking. But she wasn't. Her voice went flat. "Either put it on, or I'll shoot you in the head and tell the cops you tried to attack me." That's when it hit me. This woman was serious. I stammered something, but she screamed, "Are you deaf? Put the bag on before I shoot you dead." So I did. My world went dark. The car started moving again, and every few minutes, she'd mutter things like, "Shut up, demon. I ain't listening to your lies." She kept calling me that, a demon. Eventually, the car stopped, and she ordered me out. She guided me at gunpoint into what felt like a barn. My hands were tied around something cold and metal. When she finally pulled the bag off, I saw straw, tools, and old wood beams around me. Deborah said if I tried anything, she'd shoot me. Then she left for what felt like forever before coming back, with a little girl. Her daughter, still pointing the gun. Deborah told her kid that I was a demon and that if they prayed hard enough, I'd reveal my true form. I begged her to stop, told her I was just a normal guy, that she was making a terrible mistake. But she wouldn't listen. She told her daughter, "Hear that? Those are the devil's lies. We don't listen to the devil, do we, sweetie?" The girl didn't answer, just stared at her mom and nodded when asked questions. Then Deborah said, "You know what we do with demons, don't you?" "That's right. We destroy them." They both started praying, louder and louder, drowning out my desperate pleas. It felt like the whole world had gone insane. Nobody could hear me. Nobody was coming. When Deborah finally stopped, she told her daughter to look at me, to see the demon revealed. The little girl stared at me, shaking, and whispered, "I don't see a demon, Mommy." Deborah frowned. "Of course you do, sweetie. Look harder." But her daughter kept shaking her head. And I'll never forget how Deborah's face changed, confused, then surprised, then almost heartbroken. She looked back at me, then told her daughter, "Mommy made a mistake." I jumped in, begging her to untie me, saying, "Yes, a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. It's okay. Just let me go." But she didn't respond. Her daughter's eyes were full of tears, and Deborah finally led her back inside the house. I waited there, tied up, terrified, until Deborah came back holding the gun and that black bag again. For a second, I actually felt relief, because it meant she wasn't going to shoot me. She told me she'd been doing God's work, but sometimes even she made mistakes. She said she was sorry but couldn't let me go unless I promised never to tell anyone. At that point, I would have promised her anything. I swore to God I'd never tell a soul what happened. She put the bag back over my head, untied my hands, and led me to her car. When she finally took the bag off, we were on some dark stretch of highway I didn't recognize. She said it was close to where she'd picked me up. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I didn't care. Before driving away, she told me, "God bless you," and said I'd be rewarded in heaven if I kept quiet. But I didn't. I walked all the way back to shallow water and called the sheriff. They took my statement, but it didn't go anywhere. Without witnesses, it was just my word against hers. And when they found her, Deborah told them I was the one who'd tried to attack her after she'd kindly given me a ride home. She said I was drunk, which I was, and that I'd made a move on her. The cops said even if she got charged, it wouldn't stick. At best, she'd claim she was defending herself. They told me it was better to let it go, so I did. Rita thought I was crazy for not pressing charges. Maybe she was right, but I couldn't risk having my name dragged through the mud over something that'd end up being her word against mine. And sometimes when I think about that night, I get this sick feeling in my gut because I can't help but wonder how many others didn't walk away. I'm Italian-American on both sides of my family, and my dad's side has lived in Brooklyn since the 1930s. My grandpa, Luca, came over on a ship when he was in his 20s, and for as long as I knew him, he was the most devout Catholic man I'd ever met. He always carried his rosary beads, never missed a single mass or confession, and sprinkled holy water in his room every night to keep evil spirits away. But there was one part of his faith he never seemed to care about: pilgrimage. My grandmother used to brag about visiting the sanctuary of Madonna di Loreto and Monte Sant'Angelo, but Grandpa? He swore he'd never go back to Italy. One day when I was older, I finally asked him why. Why would a man so proud of his Italian roots and cooking never want to see his homeland again? He just said, "Because this is a new world. The things from the old one can't follow me here." I didn't know what he meant at first. Maybe heartbreak, debt, or the mafia. But when I got older, he told me a story that explained everything. He was born in 1911, and by the time he was 11, Mussolini and the fascists had taken power. Grandpa grew up poor in southern Italy, a place that worshipped Mussolini like a savior. When he turned 17, he proudly joined one of the fascist paramilitary groups. I won't name it, but it was one of the most brutal, secretive, and fanatical ones, the kind that ran their own underground prisons for the regime. These prisons held people who simply vanished. Poets, writers, rebels, anyone who spoke against the government. Grandpa thought he was serving his country, but instead, he found himself guarding cells full of broken men. Over time, the prisoners changed. It wasn't just political enemies anymore. The church had made a deal with the fascists. The Vatican would call Mussolini a good man, and in return, the fascists would help the church silence its enemies. And that's where things got strange. Because who the church called enemies wasn't always clear. Some were little cults that worshipped certain saints or practiced private rituals, not evil, just unapproved. But to the church, that was heresy. And to the fascists, that was enough to justify torture and imprisonment. Grandpa said every day they dragged in some harmless old hermit or quiet priest, until one night they brought in someone different, a man with no name. He was tall, thin, with long black hair and eyes that made the guards sick just looking at him. Even under torture, he refused to speak. When they demanded his name, he only whispered, "I don't have one. They said he led a cult that practiced blood, sacrifice on All Hallows Eve, and so he was locked away in solitary confinement. For the first time, Grandpa said he understood why. There was something wrong about that man. The air around him felt heavy, almost poisonous. Still, the guards had to keep all prisoners from losing their minds. Even the ones in solitary. They'd offer them things, cigarettes, cards, even small games. But when they asked the man with no name if he wanted anything, he said, a rock and a strip of sandpaper. The warden allowed it. After all, what harm could a rock do? So the guards gave him one, and day after day he sat in his cell, shaping that rock. At first no one thought much of it, but as weeks passed, something strange happened. The rock began to take form, smooth, oval, almost like a large stone pill, and the prison began to change. The other inmates grew restless, angry. They stopped eating, started chanting in the yard. The air itself seemed tense. Guards beat them, starved them, tried to scare them. Nothing worked. Finally, on the night of October 31st, the warden offered them a deal. Stop rioting, and they'd all get fresh bread and a cup of good wine. But instead of calming down, the prisoners got worse. That night, the entire prison erupted in chaos. Grandpa said it was like watching hell break loose. Men tearing at each other, screaming like animals. They weren't just fighting guards. They were killing each other with their bare hands. The riot raged all night. By sunrise, the ground was soaked in blood. When the guards finally re-entered, they found bodies everywhere, torn apart, mangled, piled like trash. Most prisoners were either dead or too terrified to move. But one cell stood empty, the cell of the man with no name. Well, not exactly empty. Lying in the middle of it was another inmate, dead. His chest ripped open, his heart gone. They searched the entire prison. No trace, no footprints, no sign of an escape. The man was simply gone. The warden panicked. The higher-ups couldn't know a prisoner had vanished. So he filed an official report claiming the man with no name had died during the riot, and his body was too mutilated to identify. The guards knew better. Some whispered that the chaos started only after the man began shaping that rock, that whatever he carved into existence had caused the madness. And when he finished, he didn't escape. He transformed. Not long after, Grandpa deserted. He fled Italy, smuggled himself into France, and from there boarded a ship to America. He spent his first Christmas in New York alone, unable to speak English, but he didn't care. Because America, he said, was the one place the things of the old world couldn't follow him. I could get in a lot of trouble for sharing this, so I'd really like to stay anonymous. I'm sorry if that sounds strange now, but you'll understand why by the end of this story. I'm a teacher in an English-speaking country, working with kids between 7 and 11 years old. I've been doing this for years, and honestly, I love it. I have no regrets. Teaching has given me some of the best moments of my life. But there's a darker side, too, one most people could never imagine. When you work with kids, you see wonderful things, and sometimes things that haunt you forever. At the start of one school term, I had a new student, I'll call him. He came from a non-English-speaking country, and while he struggled at first, the extra English lessons helped a lot. Within a few weeks, his personality started to shine. A's home country didn't celebrate. Halloween the way we do in the West. So when the decorations went up and everyone started talking about monsters in costumes, he was completely thrown off. He came from a very conservative culture, one that took ghosts, witches, and demons very seriously. At first, the whole thing scared him. But once I explained that Halloween was just for fun, how it's about taking what frightens us and making it silly, he started to enjoy it. My students made me proud that term. They were so kind to A, asking about his accent and background. But in that innocent way kids do. Nothing mean-spirited, just curiosity. Before long, A had friends everywhere. And around Halloween, they took it upon themselves to teach him all about vampires, zombies, and werewolves. Out of everything, the one he loved most was Dracula. When I asked why, he said he liked the idea of staying up all night and turning into something that could fly, a bat. It was adorable, watching him bond with the other kids while overcoming his fear was one of those moments that reminds you why you teach. That Halloween fell on a Friday. After lunch, my class had our little Halloween party. Costumes, masks, fake blood, the works. A showed up with plastic fangs I'd bought him and a garbage bag for a cape. He spent the whole afternoon creeping around, hissing at his classmates like a tiny vampire. The kids loved it, and I loved seeing him so happy. When the day ended, he begged to go home still wearing the cape and fangs. I said, sure, why not? That weekend, I told my boyfriend about it, laughing about how much A had gotten into the spirit. Monday came, and I was excited to see him. Again, to hear all about his vampire adventures at home. But A didn't show up to class. The headmaster called his family, and they said A was sick. He reminded them to let the school know in the future if he couldn't come in. They agreed, and that was that. But the next day, A was still absent. The headmaster called again, and they said the same thing. He was resting and would be back soon. But as the days went by and A never returned, we started to worry. After nearly 2 weeks, social services were contacted. When a social worker finally went to their home, A's parents refused to let her in. She warned them she could return with police if they didn't cooperate. But they either didn't understand or didn't care, because of bureaucratic delays. It took another full week before she could return, with an officer this time. What they found inside that house still chills me. A was lying in bed so thin he was almost unrecognizable. His parents had been caring for him in their own way. There was food and water nearby, but he hadn't eaten properly in nearly 3 weeks. He was rushed to the hospital, barely alive. The doctors were horrified. They realized quickly that A was starving to death. His parents were arrested, but when questioned, they didn't act like the neglectful or abusive parents you might imagine. They seemed heartbroken, confused even. They truly believed they'd been helping their son. You see, in their minds, A wasn't sick. He was possessed. They told police that after A's sudden obsession with vampires, ghosts, and monsters, they'd taken him to a local holy man for advice. He told them that their son had been overtaken by a demonic spirit, and the only way to drive it out was to starve it. So that's what they did, for weeks. When A didn't improve, the holy man came to their house and performed some kind of ritual and exorcism. It wasn't like what you see in movies. No priests shouting or holy water flying everywhere, but it was serious. They believed it would save their boy. When it didn't, they just kept starving him, convinced they were killing the demon, not their child. That was the most horrifying thing I've ever learned in my entire career. The thought of that sweet little boy wasting away in his bed, scared and believing there was something evil inside him. It broke me. A's parents were sentenced to prison, not for long, but they did serve time. A was placed with a foster family far away. I never saw him again. That Monday I'd been so excited to see my little vampire again. I had no idea it would be the last time I'd ever see him at all.